Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, everybody. Thanks to all our new patrons, Major Generals, Ladislav Kutsenko, Matt Stewart, Kyle Orton, Patrick St. Jean, Jamie Malcolm and Brad Hartman. If your name's not there and you were expecting it to be so, as you'd recently signed up, then please bear in mind there's a little gap between record date and air date, so that will right itself next time. For all the info on becoming a patron of the podcast, just head to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/ The History Network. There's a video of Angus and myself there explaining what we want to do from season 26 onwards, along with all the blurb about it. By signing up now, rest assured that no tip pledges will be taken until and if we release season 26, episode 1. By the way, I am at the moment rocking a pram and attempting to keep my newborn son in a state of sleep. So any gurgles and other odd noises that you're not used to on the podcast may be because I'm not doing too well in that respect. But I hope it won't affect your enjoyment of the podcast this week. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 25, episode 7, William Billy Bishop, part 1. This episode was written by Michael Gaby Gross. Michael received his master's degree in history from the California State University, Sacramento. His thesis project analyzed the Phoenix Program, a CIA counterinsurgency operation during the Vietnam War. Just 10 years after the Wright brothers successfully flew the world's first powered airplane, the First World War erupted across Europe, and with it came the First Air War. Airplanes of wood, metal and canvas took to the skies to act as observers and engage in combat with enemy planes. The best pilots became known as aces and were celebrated by both sides. Tales of chivalry abound throughout the war, as both sides respected the daring of fighter pilots. If a flyer went down behind enemy lines, the opponent would drop messages and condolences for the brave pilot, so his comrades and family back home would be informed of the loss. The Allies had their aces, and one of the most prolific was the Canadian William Avery Bishop. Called Billy or Bish by his friends and Hell's Handmaiden by the enemy, Bishop was officially credited with 72 kills. In his 2 years as a fighter pilot, Bishop became one of the most decorated aces of the war and later would be instrumental in setting up an air training program which would train the pilots who helped save the war during the Battle of Britain. Bishop was born on February the 8th, 1894 in Owen Sound, Ontario, the third child of William and Margaret Bishop. He grew up in a middle-class household where he took to solo pursuits, such as horseback riding and swimming, rather than joining with the other boys in playing hockey, football and lacrosse. That, coupled with Bishop's tendency to wear suits, collar and tie at the behest of his mother, made him an easy target for bullies. Bishop, however, was no easy prey. He quickly learnt how to defend himself and relished a good fight. The school principal would report to Bishop's parents, "As far as I can see, the only thing your son is good at is fighting." Further eschewing his studies, Bishop discovered a knack for billiards and frequented the town's seedy pool halls. Bishop's lack of direction upset his parents, as his siblings made them far prouder. But of course, years later, when Billy became the famous ace, it was he, not his well-mannered siblings, who became Owen Sound's most beloved son. His early interest in flying was limited. In 1909, when John McCurdy flew his airplane, the Silver Dart, off the frozen surface of Beddock Lake in Nova Scotia and thus became the first British subject to fly a powered, heavier-than-air machine, Billy decided to build a plane of his own. He studied newspaper photographs of McCurdy's Silver Dart and assembled his own version using boards, bedsheets, an orange crate, cardboard and much strong string. He hauled the machine up to the roof of his house, climbed in the cockpit and proceeded to nosedive into the ground. The machine was destroyed, but Billy walked away relatively unscathed. With that, he abandoned his interest in flying, for the time being. In 1911, Bishop pursued admittance to the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario. Despite not being a great student and little interest in a military career, Bishop sought an escape from Owen Sound and wanted to be more than a factory worker or delivery man. He crammed for the entrance exams and with the support of several teachers passed the tests and was accepted as a recruit. Much as he did at school in Owen Sound, Billy grew frustrated with the discipline and the constant hazing from the upperclassmen. He would write home, "We are the lowest form of military life, of any life for that matter." He suffered through his first year and failed his exams. He behaved his second year and passed the exams, but 1 year on, best behaviour was just too much for Bishop to bear. He broke countless rules and earned numerous demerits, all the while becoming very well known among the girls of Kingston. After a staff officer witnessed him drunk and a few months later caught cheating on his exams, Bishop was encouraged to not return for the next term. By then the point was moot. In the summer of 1914, Europe erupted in war. Because of his boyhood interest in riding, Bishop joined a Canadian militia cavalry regiment and was commissioned a lieutenant due to his years at the Royal Military College. When the regiment set sail for England in October 1914, Bishop was not with them. He had come down with a case of pneumonia. A few weeks later, having left the hospital, Bishop was transferred to the 7th Canadian Mounted Rifles, then mobilising for departure to Europe. Before he left, he proposed marriage to Margaret Burden, a member of the wealthy Eaton family of Toronto, whom he had known for several years. Bishop then underwent a harrowing journey across the Atlantic, where, under miserable conditions in rough seas, both men and horses became seasick. After the deaths of many horses which had been thrown overboard, the convoy reached the coast of Ireland, where it soon fell prey to German U-boats. Several ships were sunk, but Bishop's was left unscathed and sailed into port on June the 23rd, 1915. Bishop inched ever closer to war. Bishop's unit trained in England before making the crossing to France. There, while sneaking out of camp each night, Bishop met his first aviators at a local hotel and was enthralled by their tales of aerial combat. Whether the stories were true or embellished for the sake of their audience meant little to Bishop. Flying would provide the excitement he was seeking. But he knew nothing of flying, nor how to transfer to the Royal Flying Corps. He expected to go to France and fight in the trenches. Bishop wrote home regularly to complain of the camp conditions and the terrible weather. The wind swirls in off the channel constantly. When it brings rain, the whole place becomes an incredible morass of muck, mud and mire, with the special added unpleasantness that only horses in large quantities can contribute. Training becomes a travesty. What made him decide to leave the cavalry? Bishop was later to write, "It was the mud. I think that made me take to flying. I had fully expected that going into battle would mean for me the saddle of a galloping charger, instead of the snug little cockpit of a modern airplane. The mud, on a certain day in July 1915, changed my whole career." In fact, it was illness which helped with his transfer. After a particularly difficult night in the rain and cold, Bishop developed another case of pneumonia and spent several weeks in the hospital. Upon his discharge, he was given convalescence leave in London. On a tip from the pilots he met weeks earlier, he went to the War Office in London and asked for a Lord Hugh Cecil. The pilots did not know what this Cecil did, but he was known for pushing through transfers for men wishing to join the Royal Flying Corps. While Bishop remained coy on the details, and there was never an official appointment made between him and Lord Cecil, nevertheless, after a short meeting, Bishop received his transfer. Bishop's first role was not as a pilot, but rather as an observer in a two-seater aircraft. Even before he climbed into his first airplane, Bishop knew he belonged in the air. Author Alan Hind wrote, "Bishop had, as he says, the stomach for flying, that is, just sitting in the back, observing, with someone else at the stick. The very first time he ever left the ground, he knew the sky was his destiny. It was love at first flight." Bishop's duty as an observer was to signal coordinates for the military, using one-way wireless, and use cameras to photograph enemy positions beyond no man's land. Bishop found aerial photography to be both challenging and interesting, as it required patience, concentration, and precision, skills that he was too late to discover were also vital in aerial combat. The trainers praised Bishop for the clarity of his photographs, and they assigned him to tutor his fellow trainees on proper techniques. Training, however, was not without its dangers. The planes used were old, the pilots inexperienced, and there was not yet a method for safely escaping a disabled airplane. Injuries to crews during forced landings were common. Damaged airplanes were quickly repaired and sent back into the air, while the men laboured on in their preparation for the war. By Christmas 1915, Bishop earned his wing. Observer badges at the time consisted of a single wing attached to an O. The squadron expected to receive new planes prior to their departure in January, but the planes did not arrive on time. "Being flyers," Bishop wrote home, "we crossed the channel by water, of course." They began flying during the heart of winter, braving strong wind, cold rains and snowstorms, and despite wearing several layers of clothing, they returned from the flights chilled to the bone. Bishop returned from his first flight over enemy territory frostbitten. Fuel shortages, anti-aircraft fire, and enemy fighters made the work of the reconnaissance aircraft dangerous. They occasionally had escorts, but often enough it was up to the observer to man the guns and stave off enemy aircraft. Bishop studied the way the Germans fought and took note of the manoeuvres which positioned them in perfect position to destroy their target with minimal danger to themselves. He wrote, "The work of the reconnaissance and artillery machines, as well as the photography and bombing planes, is very important. But all the times I was observing, I wanted to be fighting." Bishop refused to give up on his dreams of soaring through the skies in a single-seater, engaged in a duel with the enemy. After several weeks in France, the new planes finally arrived, the Royal Aircraft Factory RE-7. It was soon discovered that these RE-7s were too slow and could not even fly with all its intended equipment. Squadrons had to strip the aircraft down to even get it to leave the ground. The crews had to remove the bombs, several of the machine guns and ammunition, while also moving to a new airfield with a longer runway, hoping the longer runway would help encourage the plane into the air. Bishop's son William, a pilot in his own right, later said of the RE-7, "It was possibly the most dangerous plane ever accepted as operational by the Allies, for one reason. Between its top speed and the speed at which it stalled and spun out of control, there was a margin of barely 20 miles per hour. This characteristic made takeoffs, landings, and manoeuvring in the air agonizingly difficult." This made Bishop's squadron quite useless in a combat role, and they were soon pulled off the line to provide aerial cover over General Sir Douglas Haig's, the commander of the British Expeditionary Force headquarters. The reassignment was short-lived, however, as Haig decided to launch a large-scale aerial offensive in the hopes of breaking the stalemate on the Western Front. The planes, stripped of their last guns and ammunition, participated in a series of raids, but the offensive quickly failed. From March to May 1916, Bishop began to experience a series of misfortunes that eventually ended his observation career. One day he got into an automobile accident that left him shaken up. Another day he was inspecting a plane in a hangar when a supporting cable broke and hit him in the head, leaving him unconscious for 2 days. Some time later he had a tooth pulled and the gun became infected. Finally he and his pilot, Roger Neville, came in for a rough landing which broke apart the airplane. Bishop was thrown forward and cracked his knee against the metal. Despite the pain, Bishop did not wish to be relieved of flying duty. He continued to walk on it, dance on it, and celebrate with his fellow crews on it. At the end of May, when the squadron was due for leave in London, Bishop had another accident and smashed his knee into a concrete pier. By this point, Bishop could not put any pressure on the knee, nor could he sleep due to the severe pain. He limped to the nearest Royal Flying Corps hospital and was confined to bed indefinitely. After a several-month stint resting his knee, which included a trip home to Owen Sound after his father suffered a minor stroke, Bishop wanted to get back into the war. While his repaired knee healed, Bishop's squadron returned to France and participated in the Battle of the Somme. He wanted to rejoin the squadron, but he could not receive medical clearance. Following the battle, he received the distressing news there was no squadron to return to. His squadron had suffered devastating losses and the survivors would be parcelled out to other units. Bishop then turned his attention back to becoming a fighter pilot. He once again wrote to Lord Cecil and other influential individuals to get his transfer. The enormous casualties suffered by the Allies during the Battle of the Somme also included the Air Force. The Royal Flying Corps needed pilots. Bishop's timing worked in his favour. In September he was ordered to Central Flying School to begin his training. Bishop had an advantage over his fellow trainees as he was already an experienced flyer. He did not lose his composure in the air, but he was not a very good pilot. Bishop reflected, "I tried very hard, but it seemed to me that I just could not get the proper feel of the machine." Sometimes he gripped the controls too lightly and jerked the plane through the air, while other times too lightly and the plane refused to follow his instruction. His nervous instructions took matters and the controls into their own hands to ensure a safe return to the hangar. Finally, after a meagre 3 hours of flying time, Bishop took his first solo flight. Despite his inexperience, Bishop managed to get the plane into the air and flying. He felt at home behind the controls and a master of his destiny. While he felt the flying went smoothly, the trainees watched from the ground as Bishop pitched and rolled through the air, his movements choppy and undisciplined. After flying around the airfield for some time, he realized he soon would need to land. Landing was not a strength for him, and he soon would gain a reputation for causing more damage to his planes by landing than did any fight with the enemy. This first solo landing was as rough as he expected. He came in hard and skidded off the runway. The fellow trainees rushed to assist, but Bishop was unhurt and the plane relatively undamaged. He was finally a pilot. In November, after 2 months of classroom and aerial instruction, Bishop received his pilot's wings and joined 37 Squadron, then stationed in Essex, whose responsibility included the defence of London. Bishop grew bored with guard duty. He wanted to be where the action was. He wanted to be on the front. He soon got his wish and transferred to 60 Squadron in northern France, along with a dozen other replacement pilots. There, at headquarters, was a blackboard posted with the squadron's aces. At the top of the list was the famous Albert Ball, Britain's leading ace, who, at that time, had 29 kills. Bishop, despite being 3 years older than Ball, looked up to the famous flyer and sought to surpass him. It was Ball who told Bishop about the Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen's flying circus, of how the headhunters, members of that scarlet ship circus, usually 5 or 6 in number, used to delight in hiding in the clouds and pouncing on an allied lame duck. "I won't be flying entirely for sport now," Bishop said. "I'll be flying to kill too." Despite his tough talk, Bishop struggled mightily in his Nieuport 17 plane immediately upon joining the squadron. While the German army retreated from the Somme, the German air service remained master of the air. In his first flight, Bishop fought to keep his plane in formation and had a rough go of it when German anti-aircraft fire nearly shot him down. He said of his first flight, "The way I clung to my companions that day reminded me of some little child hanging to its mother's skirts while crossing a crowded street. I was so intent on the clinging part that I paid very little attention to anything else." A few days later he crash-landed in front of the bridge commander and was ordered to return to England for more training. This embarrassing turn of events brought Bishop shame. He worked hard to become a fighter pilot, and only after a few weeks he had already failed. His squadron commander, Alan Scott, pointed out that Bishop was not due to return to England for a few days, so in the meantime he would continue to go on missions. This would end up saving Bishop's career. On March 25th came my first real flight in the air, and, as luck would have it, my first victory. The squadron was intercepted by 3 German planes, and they broke off into individual dogfights. Bishop chased one. He fired his Lewis gun, and the enemy began to fall out of control. This manoeuvre, however, was a feint. The Germans pretended to lose control while their attacker moved on. Then they would regain control and appear behind their former attacker. Bishop was wise to such a ploy and drove after his target. I had forgotten caution and everything else in my wild and overwhelming desire to destroy this thing that, for the time being, represented all of Germany to me. I could not be more than 40 yards behind the Hun when he flattened out, and I again opened fire. This time the German plane crashed into the ground. Bishop had little time to celebrate, as oil had pooled in his engine during this chase, and it soon sputtered to a stop. Bishop could not restart the engine and began to lose altitude. Not knowing where he was, Bishop scanned the ground for a safe place to land and repair his engine. He found an open field and landed. While inspecting his engine, he heard shouts from afar and scrambled into a nearby shell hole. The Germans must have seen him land, as it was getting dark. Bishop did not risk trying to repair his engine, and instead spent a rainy night in no man's land. The next morning Bishop once again attempted to repair his engine, and once again heard voices. While he quietly debated whether to surrender or go down fighting, he realized the voices were speaking English. The soldiers appeared, and they were indeed British Tommies. They too saw him land, and kept an eye on him during the night. They also witnessed his first victory in the air, giving him the required confirmation. He caught a ride back to the airfield, and later helped tow his damaged plane back to the hangar. The brigade commander congratulated Bishop and rescinded his order for Bishop to return to England. Bishop became a flight commander and soon bagged his second victory. Along with his assigned squadron missions, Bishop began to take unofficial solo flights with the permission of the squadron commander Scott, and soon his victories increased. On April the 8th, 1917, Bishop gained the status of ace by scoring his 4th, 5th and 6th victories. Historian Lee Kennett wrote of the ace system, The status of ace, which came with the 5th victory, was never an official designation, but a title accorded by press and public. The pilots did not refer to each other as aces around the airfield. The term was used by journalists to publish positive stories about the war. In a time when the Germans maintained air supremacy, any good news was worth publishing. Some pilots would later accept this honorary title in appreciation of their achievements. In this, Major Scott was Bishop's biggest supporter, not only for allowing him to fly these solo missions, but also by providing verifications on Bishop's kills. Bishop was the newest ace of 60 Squadron, and in celebration, Bishop's mechanic painted the plane's nose blue. He would later receive the Military Cross in recognition of his success during the Battle of Vimy Ridge, the first of many awards to come his way. The Germans would soon know that the pilot of the blue-nosed aircraft was a dangerous fellow. More from Billy Bishop in part 2 next episode. Do remember to go and check out our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Michael Gaby Gross, read by Nick Barker.